Hi, my name is Thomas Wood, and I'm going to. My company is called Fast Data Science, and I'm going to talk to you about AI and natural language processing in the pharma industry. So there's a number of examples of AI that we see in the industry at the moment. So within and outside pharma, there's traditional machine learning and statistics, which a typical example would be you have a student, you know a bunch of things about them, and you want to predict the likelihood of them failing their exam. And that's kind of things that you could do in Excel or with pen and paper. It's very simple, very easy to understand, but it's often got a lot of impact. And then the next type of AI I'm going to discuss is deep learning. So that's typically things like image classification. So if you have images of fire hydrants or factory defects and you want to classify them, then you can use deep learning and neural networks. Generative AI I'm going to touch on. So that's tasks like, people using GPT to write blog posts and so on, and how that could feature in pharma. And then finally, I'm going to touch on natural language processing, which is the area that I'm mostly working in. So that, with NLP, traditional natural language processing, we can do things like you find all the countries mentioned in a text, find all the drug names mentioned in a document, identify, molecular weights and things. So lots of useful things for pharma using not particularly sophisticated tools. So a brief overview of the drug development pipeline. At the start of drug development, you have around 10,000 compounds which are identified by the biologists and pharmacologists in the organization. And then those go through the drug discovery and the preclinical pipeline. And by the time you've eliminated the ones that have no prospect of eventually becoming a drug on the market, you might end up with 250. So there's a lot of dropout at every stage of this pipeline. You then go through to clinical trials. After phase 3, you get FDA approval, and typically maybe of the original 10,000 that you had at the start, you might only have one by the end, and then you move on to phase 4 approval. So every stage of to the phase 4 trial, rather, every stage of this process, a large amount of text data is generated. So at the drug discovery stage, there's things like scientific literature, which is publications that list molecules or list interactions between molecules or molecules and targets. So there's a lot of NLP you can do there. There's also things like deep learning and really smart AI models that get used in the drug discovery stage as well, but I'm focusing today on natural language processing. Then during the clinical trial process, you have protocols. So typical, let's find a protocol. This is an entry in a clinical trial registry of a trial, and that comes with this document, the protocol, which is quite long. This one is 59 pages long, so this is actually a really short one, and a lot of the information about the trial is contained in tables like this one, so which is quite hard to handle without natural language processing. So so that's the phase. The phase 1 to 3, you get a lot of text documents generated. You also get documents that list the narrative of what happened in the trial. So you get reports on all the adverse events, all the things that went wrong during the trial, all the reactions that people had to drugs, to the drugs that they were given, and that can be PDFs that are thousands of pages long. And so harvesting through all this data is pretty hard work, and that's where natural language processing comes in. By the time the drug gets towards the end of the clinical trials, you get the FDA approval, the drug goes on the market, and you get to phase 4. And in phase 4, large amounts of text data is also generated. So you have real world evidence, you have documentation of any adverse effect, any adverse event that's associated with the drug. You have interviews with doctors, where the pharma company investigates, what do doctors think about this drug? Are they prescribing it? Are they hesitating to prescribe it? Are they saying that patients don't like it? And so all of that gets fed back in, again, in text format. So all through this drug development pipeline, but especially towards the end, large amounts of text data is generated. And that's something that, we have to handle. And that's where natural language processing is coming in. The next question is AI, is it even needed? So for a lot of initiatives, candidate initiatives of AI in a business, whether that's in pharma or elsewhere, we, quite often the first thing I do is I ask, do we need to use AI to solve this problem? So imagine if you want to estimate the cost of building completing a building. You can also just take the average cost that it took in the past and take a reference class, and that's pretty effective too. So AI doesn't always add value on top of those really simple approaches. And before we get started, quite often we would explore all the candidate AI initiatives that you could do in that organization, and then work out for each one the technical effort that's required, so we can quantify that, use surveys, use quantitative methods, and work out, okay, is this how hard or easy it is, and then high or low business impact. And really the things that you want to do in a business, whether that's pharma or in another industry, is find things in the top left where there's a high business impact and they're also easy to do. And quite often those are things like predicting risks, predicting things going wrong. So I'm going to walk through first the traditional machine learning and how we use that in pharma. So a lot of the most valuable uses of AI are when you have a load of data in the organization, you have in-house knowledge as well. Let's say you have data on clinical trials that were run in the past, and you can just use a really, really simple machine learning model to build predictions. So for each clinical trial, you have information that such as where it was run, what kind of condition it was run for, how many people participated, and you have the cost for the past trials. And given a new trial, can you predict what it's going to cost? So there are public data sets. So here's an example. This is one that you can find quite easily on Google Docs. And this is a data set of past clinical trials, and where the cost, this column, or these two columns, was made public as a result generally of things like freedom of information requests. So I'm going to just do a quick demonstration of how we can have a look at that in Python. So this is what I can do. I can just download that data set. I can clean it. I just delete all the dirty rows and everything. And I end up with, let's say, 79 rows of each one corresponding to a clinical trial that was run in the past. And I can do very simple things like just work out, okay, what's the cost in dollars of phase 1, phase 1/2, phase 2, 2/3, and so on. And I can even plot that as a bar chart. And then I can do things like build a regression model. So I can say, let's create a regression model where I'm only giving, all I know is the enrollment of a trial. And then I can look inside that model, and I find, okay, it's basically saying the cost of a trial is was 6.8 million plus 15,000 times the number of participants. So then I can say, predict for imagine a new trial with 100 participants, what's the cost? And it's given me this value. So that's obviously not a huge amount of use because it's only using the cost, but we can chuck in a few more values. So in this case, I'm adding the enrollment, and then is it cancer or not as a binary feature, and then all these phases as a binary feature. And I can do the same thing, predict the cost for a trial with 100 participants, which is phase 1. And let's say, oh, what if this trial was phase 2? And I could just simulate and go to change attributes of my hypothetical trial. So this is a really really effective way of of getting some business value out of data that you've got. And it's very simple. So, however, the caveat is one part of this is very hard, which is finding a clean data set. So the data set that I have is pretty small. Companies often don't like making their clinical trial cost data public. Even if you do have access to it, you have to clean it, you have to join it from all over the place. And if it were in the correct format, then doing this, what I've just done, even with Excel, is just, pretty effective. And, it has the advantage that it's simple and it's understandable. So this kind of thing, if you can do this kind of initiative, is great, and it's very effective. However, so looking at the types of initiatives that I've seen both in pharma companies and other industries, some of the things that really tend to deliver the most value for the organization is often, predicting cost, predicting duration of a project, or predicting the likelihood of the project failing. So I like to think of this as like a gray swan, a clinical trial failing, or let's say a construction project overrunning, like the Sydney Opera House, or things like that. That's a gray swan. It's something that it doesn't come out of nowhere. And when you have data, when you have reference classes, and you have, you can even build a table of 70 past projects that were similar to that, you can predict these adverse events and you can mitigate them. So this kind of initiative is really quite valuable for pharma companies, but also for other, companies in other industries, because you're not just saving costs, you're not just, let's say, cutting a small administrative cost, you're actually changing the way the business operates. And the next kind of machine learning I'm going to talk about is neural networks, without huge pharma emphasis in this case. So neural networks have been around, like really around and influencing what we do for nearly 10 years. And instead of, let's say, what the example that I had with the clinical trials, or with the student that's likely to fail their exams, instead of having a few data points on each instance, I have a huge number. I have an image made of 1 million pixels. So let's say the task is to classify an image of a retina as one of a number of conditions, or classifying a wind turbine blade. And then, so the neural networks, they could be used on images, text, video, audio, pretty much all these kind of things that are really big files on your computer. And in pharma, most of the usage that I've seen of this type of machine learning is way back in the beginning of the pipeline, in the preclinical and the drug discovery stage. So I haven't really been working with these so much. Illustration of what neural networks do, a lot of people will have seen this kind of thing. So there's a challenge called the ImageNet challenge, where which is what we use as a yardstick for evaluating neural networks sometimes. And there's 1,000 images, 1,000 image classes in this challenge. And prior to the convolutional neural networks, no computer model had any chance of really correctly identifying the species in these images. But now, convolutional neural networks can manage these pretty amazing feats, distinguish a husky from a grey wolf, things like that. And so, in business, you can imagine the potential. You have images, let's say images of a manufacturing pipeline, or things that got broken, or images, ultrasound images, and they can do what they can classify images sometimes far better than a human can. The disadvantages of this approach compared to the traditional machine learning, which I covered earlier, is you need a lot of computing power to deploy them. They're really expensive to run for real-time predictions. So you often need to have an account with Google, AWS, or Azure, Microsoft Azure, and you have to pay a monthly bill, which you'll get a discount on it for the first 1 or 2 years, and then it tends to go up. It's pretty hard to develop these and train them. They're hard to understand. And also, something that I often don't see discussed is really the business value that these offer as well is not always as what you would get from those very simple machine learning models, that like the cost prediction. For example, if you do replace an ultrasonographer with a deep learning system that can classify the ultrasound images, that's not, you can only replace one part of that person's job. You're not going to replace all the other things that they do, like patient interaction, decision making, diagnostics, and so on. So and a computer vision system, let's say if it's used in a factory, deployed in a factory to replace a minimum wage worker, it may replace one worker, but it doesn't necessarily revolutionize the business in the same way that the the cost prediction or the risk prediction does on a project level. The next thing we're going to look at is traditional natural language processing. So in this case, a company has large amounts of unstructured data, like the protocol that I showed you before. So, this kind of document. And then how, that data is just sitting there in PDFs. This often happens in the legal industry, in finance, in medical, in pharma, in insurance. And how can you use a huge PDF? You have a gold mine of information hidden inside PDFs. For example, an example from outside pharma is ships. So in shipping, you have ships being detained by port authorities, and that's very expensive for the shipping company. But prior to a ship being detained, it doesn't really come out of nowhere. You have a PDF of all the inspections that the ship underwent. So if the ship had a bunch of inspections in the past where, poor fire safety was highlighted, then that ship is very likely to be detained the next time it calls into a port. So that kind of thing is really quite valuable, and that's really taking the example I've just done of the clinical trials and taking it one step higher. So and one way to think about this is, imagine in your business, if you have an unlimited supply of smart graduates who understand your business process, and they have access to all these PDFs that you have floating around your business, what would they do when they see a new document coming in? So that smart graduate, when they see a document coming in saying this ship has defective lifeboats, they would say, okay, that's likely to be detained, but we don't always have the resources for that. And the same with a clinical trial. If a smart graduate sees a clinical trial protocol and there's something wrong with the sample size, they will say this trial is likely to fail, because trials like this in this way in the past were likely to fail. Quick illustration of the rule-based NLP. So imagine you have an input sentence like this, which mentions some drugs by name. So we've got tools that will just very quickly pick out all the drugs and map them to URLs, to IDs and so on. And then from that, we can do things like, we can get all the properties of the drug. We can find out, is this document talking about small molecule drugs? Is it talking about biological drugs? Is it talking about, what is it discussing? And that's, that in itself, it's not really even AI, it's just rules, but it's pretty powerful, pretty useful. Another area that I've seen NLP, or some of the projects I'm working on for pharma, in the pharma industry, are this kind of thing, where you have regulatory compliance. So when the trial is run, you get the huge narrative reports which come out of it. So that could be 2,000 pages long, and they describe something like, they might look like this. I mean, this one is, I generated it with GPT, but this is this kind of thing where you have a discussion of how the patient responded to the drug, and then other things that are not related to that. And what we can do is we can redact things that related to the guy's visit to A&E, which is not part of the drug trial itself. And so that's something that we can do with AI, and we're working on that. And that's kind of regulatory compliance. That's quite an important area of pharma as well. Another one is, after the drug gets approved and it's on the market, you have key opinion leader insights. So a doctor will say something like, I would hesitate to just prescribe this and that drug together, because of the interaction. And that's something that we can highlight. We can highlight interactions, or highlight any consistent opinion that comes up from interview transcripts, and that's really quite valuable. That's right at the very end of the drug pipeline, after the drug is on the market and it's been approved. You get a lot of transcripts like this coming up. Where the NLP really gets really interesting and really powerful is this hybrid. So combining my traditional machine learning that I did at the beginning in Python with the natural language processing, you you can actually take the protocol document, so a document like this, and predict the cost directly from this document, which is basically the best of both worlds. And so that's one project that I'm working on at the moment, combining machine learning and natural language processing to predict the cost in dollars of a trial using the PDF. So I'll show that at the end. Generative AI. So this is one that I haven't really been using in pharma because there's a number of reasons why you can't really use it for a lot of these purposes. It's not, it's very, very new. It would be hard to get clients or regulators approval. It often involves using third-party companies to process your data. And it's also, it's also widely understood. So people people use it as a search engine. People, expect it to be able to retrieve information, but it is very powerful. And the way I like to describe it is it's like the predictive text on your old Nokia phone, but much, much smarter. And, it's basically just constantly predicting the next sequence of words. So it doesn't, that's why, it sometimes does things that are very clever, but sometimes does things that are less clever. Doing generative AI on, in the pharma projects, you would need a lot more computing power than the deep learning solutions that we've seen in the past. So for that reason, a lot of people are using third party, such as OpenAI or Gemini. However, you've got to be very careful. Things that you wouldn't post online on social media, you shouldn't be sending to the generative AI solutions. We've all seen that they're prone to hallucinations. They can be slow. You're dependent on a company continuing to allow you to use their service. And also training your own LLM is pretty hard work. So this stuff is very new. It is making an impact in pharma, but you're constrained a bit by regulation, by privacy, by the constraints around sending stuff to third parties. You can host it yourself and get around it, but still there's a lot you can achieve with the methods I mentioned earlier that you don't necessarily need to resort to generative AI. So the four areas I've covered, and they're kind of broad areas. There's traditional machine learning, where the participants in the trial, the pathology, the location, and you can predict the cost. Great if you've got a table of really neat data in Excel. There's deep learning, which is human-like classification of things like images. That's pretty hard to do, expensive to run, but pretty amazing when it works. Generative AI. This is human-like responses. It's a bit of a legal gray area still. People are working out when they're allowed to send data to things like third-party services and when they aren't. You have a bunch of dependencies on third-party companies, which may increase their prices and so on. And there's litigation going on. So some of these organizations, some of the companies making generative AI models have scraped information from the internet, and now lawsuits are coming up. So, but it's a pretty exciting area as well. And then traditional natural language processing, which is really any analysis of text data. So the PDFs that are floating around companies is pretty hard to do, but is high value, especially if you can combine it with the traditional machine learning. So, so where NLP in particular fits in the pharmaceutical, I would say at the preclinical stage, it would take the form, or from what I've seen so far, not exclusive to just what I'm listing here, quite often how you would use it would be for analyzing scientific literature, finding candidate interactions, and so on. In drug manufacturing, it's also useful. You can use it for analyzing supply chains and so on. And in the clinical stage, so phases 1 to 3 in particular, you can de-risk the trials. You can use it for redaction, and then phase 4, you can also, we're using pharma, NLP in pharma for for things like marketing, and also for analyzing the insights from doctors, from key opinion leaders, and so on, analyzing interview transcripts. So so far, I'll show you a brief demo of one of the tools that we've developed as well, because this is kind of an illustration of the cost assessment. So this tool, clinical trial risks, you can find it at clinicaltrialrisk.org. And how this works is you can upload, let's say I can upload the PDF of the protocol that I just downloaded, and what we can see, it analyzes the PDF and works out an estimate of the cost of running that trial, or of the risk of running that trial. And we're working now on cost models. I'm just going to refresh this and pick a different one from the list, actually. Yeah, there we are. So this one, so we can see it identifies the pathology, identifies the phase, and the statistical analysis plan, the effect estimate, number of subjects participating in the trial, number of arms, countries, and simulation, whether the trial uses simulation. And eventually we get an assessment that this is a high-risk trial. So what we're adding to this tool at the moment is a bunch of extra features, and the ability to extract data from the tables inside the PDF, and the ability to predict the cost of the trial in dollars. So this tool is going to become a lot more powerful pretty soon. We're not using generative AI in it at the moment. So, and part of that is due to the restrictions on privacy and confidentiality of data. But it's a pretty exciting area to be working in. So thanks very much. If you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat. And you can contact me at fastdatascience.com. Thank you.